Hi there. Tonight we journey back to a time when might made right, and the landscape was dotted with colossal stone giants, medieval castles. Forget the fairy tale images of turrets and flags. We're going to dive into the brutal, often terrifying, the reality of how these imposing fortresses were actually built. Imagine, for a moment, standing at the base of a newly planned castle site. The air vibrates not with magic, but with the raw, relentless energy of thousands of sweaty, calloused hands, chipping, hauling, and hammering. The sheer scale of the undertaking is mind-boggling. You're talking about moving mountains, piece by heavy piece, with nothing but muscle, rope, and the most basic of tools. Building one of these behemoths wasn't just a construction project. It was an act of sheer will, a monumental display of power, and, for almost everyone involved, a brutal nightmare of backbreaking labor. You probably wouldn't last a day without pulling a muscle or losing a finger, let alone a whole season so, before you get comfortable. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling up to it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore why building a castle in medieval times was a brutal nightmare, focusing on the grit and grind of its creation. The concept of a fortified dwelling, a place of safety and control, stretches back far beyond the medieval period. Humans have always sought refuge, from prehistoric caves to simple earthworks and palisades. But the medieval castle, as we typically envision it, with its towering stone walls, deep moats, and formidable gatehouses, began to truly emerge in Europe around the 10th and 11th centuries, reaching its peak in the 12th and 13th centuries. This wasn't some sudden architectural revelation. It was an evolutionary process, driven by necessity and the constant threat of conflict. Early castles, known as matandably castles, were surprisingly simple. A large earthen mound, the motte, topped with a wooden tower, surrounded by a palisade and a ditch, the bailey. You could throw one of these up relatively quickly, in a matter of weeks or months, if you had enough hands. They were the original flat-pack castles, just made of dirt and logs. But as warfare evolved, so too did the need for stronger, more permanent defenses. Raids became more organized, sieges more sophisticated. Wood, while quick to erect, was terribly vulnerable to fire and determined attackers. Enter stone. Stone was durable, fire-resistant, and intimidating, but transitioning from timber to stone was like upgrading from a tricycle to a tank. The complexity, cost, and sheer effort multiplied exponentially. This shift marked the true beginning of the brutal nightmare we're exploring tonight. The scale of these stone structures was unprecedented for the time, often requiring the mobilization of vast resources and thousands of laborers, pushing the limits of medieval engineering and human endurance. Historians still argue whether the transition from wood to stone was primarily driven by military necessity or by a desire for lords to display their wealth and power. The very act of deciding to build a stone castle was a declaration, not just of wealth, but of an absolute willingness to commit immense resources, human and material, to a single, colossal project. It was a commitment that would stretch for years, sometimes decades, consuming lives and fortunes. This foundational decision, born of strategic necessity and a lord's ambition, laid the groundwork for the relentless labor and hardship that would define the entire construction process. You weren't just building a home. You were building a statement carved in rock and sweat. So, why did medieval lords decide to pour their immense wealth and the sweat of thousands into constructing these monumental stone fortresses? It wasn't just about having a really cool pad with a fantastic view. The motivations for building a castle were deeply rooted in the turbulent and often violent realities of medieval life, driven by both strategic necessity and the very potent desire for political power and prestige. Imagine you're a powerful lord in the 11th or 12th century. Your lands are vast, but so are the ambitions of your neighbors. Feuds between nobles were common, border skirmishes a constant threat, and the authority of kings was often tenuous at best. In this fractured political landscape, a castle wasn't just a home. It was a defensive stronghold, a secure base from which to project your influence and protect your people. It was your insurance policy against a sudden raid, a safe haven during a siege, and a place to store your most valuable assets, from grain to gold. Without a castle, your wealth and your very life were always at risk. It's a bit like trying to run a successful business today without a proper security system or even a locked door. You're just asking for trouble. From a military standpoint, a well-placed castle could control vital trade routes, river crossings, or strategic passes. It could serve as a garrison point for your soldiers, allowing you to quickly deploy forces to defend your territory or launch offensive campaigns. During times of war, a castle could withstand a siege for months, tying up enemy forces and giving you crucial time to gather reinforcements or for external events to shift in your favor. Its very existence served as a deterrent. Attacking a heavily fortified castle was a costly, time-consuming, and often futile endeavor. A castle was, quite simply, the ultimate military technology of its day, a fixed point of immense power. Historians still argue whether castles were primarily offensive or defensive structures. But beyond the purely military considerations, castles were also powerful symbols of authority and legitimacy. In an age when power was often fragmented, building a massive stone fortress visibly demonstrated your wealth, your might, and your right to rule. It projected an image of permanence and strength that demanded respect and obedience from your vassals and intimidated your rivals. A lord with a grand castle was clearly someone to be reckoned with, someone who commanded vast resources and could defend his claims. It was the medieval equivalent of having the biggest, most impenetrable skyscraper in the city skyline, shouting, "I'm in charge here." For the populace, the castle was a complex symbol. It was a place of refuge in times of danger, offering protection to peasants who might huddle within its walls during an attack. But it was also a visible reminder of the lord's dominance, the seat of justice and often injustice, and the place where taxes were collected. It represented order and stability, but also oppression and feudal obligations. The decision to build a castle, therefore, was never a light one. It was a calculated move, driven by the brutal realities of medieval warfare and the strategic imperative to consolidate and display power in a world where might truly was right. Once the decision to build a castle was made, the very first, and arguably most critical, step was choosing the perfect spot. This wasn't just about picking a scenic hilltop. It was a decision laden with strategic, logistical, and even geological considerations. A mistake here could doom the entire project to failure, or at the very least, make the brutal nightmare of construction even worse. Imagine you're the lord, or perhaps his chief engineer, surveying the landscape. You're not looking for good vibes. You're looking for natural defenses. The ideal site would offer a commanding view of the surrounding territory, allowing early detection of approaching enemies. High ground, like a hilltop or a rocky outcrop, was always preferred. This elevation forced attackers to fight uphill, exhausting them before they even reached your walls, and made it difficult for their siege engines to gain effective range. Think of a medieval drone shot. You want to see everything below you, and you want everyone below you to look up in awe and fear. Water was another absolutely critical factor. A castle, designed to withstand long sieges, needed a reliable internal water source. This meant looking for sites with accessible springs or areas where a deep well could be dug within the castle's perimeter. Proximity to a river or stream could also be a major advantage, providing a natural moat or a means of transport for materials, though direct access to drinking water inside the walls was paramount. You don't want your defenders dying of thirst while the enemy just chills by the river outside. It's like planning a camping trip and forgetting to pack water. A rookie mistake with catastrophic consequences. Natural obstacles were also highly prized. A bend in a river, a steep cliff face, or a marshy bog could serve as ready-made defenses, reducing the amount of manual labor needed to create ditches or strengthen walls. Building on a rocky spur not only provided elevation but also a solid, unyielding foundation that was difficult for attackers to undermine. Conversely, building on soft, unstable ground meant constantly battling subsidence, drainage issues, and the risk of your colossal stone walls slowly sinking into the earth. Historians still argue whether strategic location or access to building materials was the more significant factor in site selection. Beyond defense, practical logistics played a huge role. Was there a source of suitable building materials nearby? This meant proximity to quarries for stone and forests for timber. Hauling enormous stones and logs over long distances with medieval technology was an incredibly arduous task, so minimizing transport time and effort was a major cost and labor saver. A nearby workforce, or at least a fertile area that could support a large temporary population of laborers, was also a subtle but vital consideration. Finally, the site needed to be defensible, but also accessible for your own supplies and reinforcements. A castle that was too isolated might be impregnable, but also impossible to supply or reinforce, turning it into a very secure, but ultimately doomed, prison. The perfect spot was a delicate balance of military advantage, logistical feasibility, and resource availability, turning the initial survey into a grueling strategic puzzle that laid the groundwork for years of brutal construction. With the ideal site finally chosen, perhaps a rocky outcrop overlooking a river, or a strategic hill commanding a fertile valley, the next monumental task began: the early earthworks and moats. Before a single stone could be laid for the walls, the ground itself had to be prepared, sculpted, and manipulated into the initial layers of defense. This wasn't glamorous work. It was pure, unadulterated, backbreaking manual labor, carried out by thousands of unskilled hands with the simplest of tools. Imagine yourself as one of these laborers. You're not wielding a pickaxe or shovel with the precision of a modern excavator. You're using basic tools that have barely evolved since the Roman Empire, or even earlier. Your main implements are shovels made of wood with iron tips, picks, and perhaps primitive mattocks. Your muscles are your primary engine, sweat is your fuel, and the sun or biting wind is your constant companion. The sheer volume of earth, too, be moved was staggering. Historians still argue whether the initial earthworks were primarily for defense or simply to provide material for marts. The first order of business was often to clear the site. This meant felling any trees, removing bushes, and leveling uneven ground. This timber, however, wasn't wasted. It would be put to immediate use for temporary structures, tools, or even the first palisades. Then came the digging on a truly colossal scale. Moats had to be excavated, sometimes dozens of feet deep and wide, encircling the entire planned castle. This wasn't just a decorative ditch. It was a formidable obstacle designed to slow down attackers, prevent siege towers from reaching the walls, and channel enemy forces into specific killing zones. Digging a moat meant loosening earth and rock, then shoveling or carrying it away, often in baskets or on crude stretchers, piece by agonizing piece. If the castle was to be built on a motte, an artificial mound, the scale of earth movement was even greater. Thousands of cubic yards of soil and rock had to be excavated from the surrounding ditches and piled up to form a substantial, defensible hill. This wasn't precise engineering. It was brute force moving earth. The spoil from the moat often contributed to the height of the motte or the outer earthworks, making the process slightly more efficient, if no less grueling. It's like digging a giant hole in your backyard, but instead of stopping when you hit a sprinkler pipe, you keep going until you've moved enough dirt to build a small mountain. And you're doing it with a tiny garden spade. These early earthworks were incredibly important. They established the fundamental defensive layout of the castle before a single stone wall rose. The steep sides of a motte, the slippery slopes of a ditch, and the watery depths of a moat all created formidable passive defenses that would deter all but the most determined and well-equipped attackers. For the laborers, however, it was a baptism by fire, a grueling introduction to the relentless physical demands of medieval castle construction, setting the tone for the brutal years that lay ahead. It was a clear sign that this wasn't going to be a walk in the park. It was going to be a long, painful marathon of muscle and dirt. With the earthworks established and the initial defensive layout in place, the true logistical nightmare of building a stone castle began. Quarrying the stone. Medieval castles, as you might imagine, required an unfathomable amount of rock, thousands upon thousands of tons, to form their massive walls, towering keeps, and intricate gatehouses. This wasn't something you could just order online and have delivered. It had to be ripped from the earth, often by hand, in a process that was as brutal as it was essential. Imagine yourself in a medieval quarry, a vast open scar on the landscape, often miles from the actual construction site. The air is thick with dust, the clang of hammers on chisels, and the groans of laborers. Your tools are remarkably simple: heavy iron picks, wedges, sledgehammers, and crowbars. There's no dynamite, no power saws, no hydraulic lifts. It's pure, unadulterated muscle and rudimentary physics. The process would begin by identifying a suitable vein of stone, ideally one that was relatively easy to work but durable enough for construction. Limestone, sandstone, and granite were common choices, depending on the region. Historians still argue whether medieval quarrying techniques were truly primitive or surprisingly sophisticated for their time. The quarryman would first carefully study the rock face, looking for natural fault lines or weaknesses. Then they would begin the slow, arduous process of undercutting a large block. They would chip away at the base of the rock, creating a channel. Once a substantial undercut was achieved, they would drive wooden wedges into cracks or artificially cut grooves in the stone. These wedges would then be repeatedly soaked with water. As the wood absorbed the water, it would swell, exerting immense pressure that could eventually split massive blocks of stone from the quarry face. It's a bit like trying to break a giant chocolate bar by slowly expanding a small crack. Eventually, with enough patience and force, it snaps. Once a huge block was separated, it then had to be broken down into manageable sizes. This involved more hammering, more chiseling, and a lot of sheer brute force. Imagine trying to break a boulder larger than a small car into smaller pieces, using only hand tools. It was slow, dangerous work, with a constant threat of falling rock, collapsing quarry faces, and flying stone fragments. Accidents were incredibly common, leading to broken bones, crushed limbs, and even death. The quarry was, for many, a literal graveyard. The quality of the stone was paramount. A good master mason would oversee the quarrying operation, rejecting any stone that was too brittle, too porous, or prone to weathering. This meant that a huge amount of effort could go into extracting stone that was ultimately deemed unsuitable, only to be discarded, adding to the waste and the endless cycle of labor. The very first breath of the castle, its raw material, was steeped in the sweat, toil, and peril of these unsung quarrymen, whose relentless efforts laid the literal foundation for every mighty wall and soaring tower. Once the massive blocks of stone were brutally wrenched from the earth in the quarry, the next, equally daunting challenge arose, transporting these heavy and wieldy materials to the actual construction site. Imagine trying to move boulders for miles over uneven, unpaved medieval terrain, with no engines, no paved roads, and certainly no large trucks. This logistical nightmare was a major bottleneck in castle construction, consuming immense time, labor, and resources. Your primary modes of transport were incredibly basic: oxen, horses, and, most commonly, human muscle. For shorter distances, or smaller stones, laborers would simply carry the stones on their backs, or on simple wooden stretchers. For larger, truly enormous blocks, the kind needed for foundations or cornerstones, you'd need a more elaborate setup. Think of a heavy, solid wooden sledge or cart, often with solid wheels, pulled by teams of oxen. These animals were incredibly strong but slow, and their pace dictated the rate at which materials arrived at the site. One broken axle, one bogged wheel in the mud, and the entire operation could grind to a halt. It's like trying to move your entire house using only a handcart and a very tired donkey. It's technically possible, but you're going to be there for a while. The terrain itself was a constant adversary. Medieval roads were little more than dirt tracks, often muddy in wet weather, dusty in dry spells, and riddled with ruts and potholes. Navigating these paths with heavy loads was incredibly difficult. Bridges were rare, so rivers often had to be forded, or temporary rafts constructed to ferry materials across. Steep inclines were another massive hurdle, requiring even larger teams of animals or dozens of men straining on ropes to haul stones uphill. Each journey was a battle against gravity, friction, and the unforgiving landscape. Historians still argue whether medieval transport methods were surprisingly efficient or a major limiting factor in large-scale construction. The logistics involved not just moving stone, but also vast quantities of timber, sand, clay, and water, all vital for construction. Timber, particularly, was often sourced from distant forests and had to be floated down rivers or dragged overland by teams of animals. Ensuring a continuous supply of all these materials required meticulous planning, constant coordination, and a huge number of laborers dedicated solely to transport. This wasn't just about moving. It was about organizing a massive, decentralized supply chain. Centuries before the invention of spreadsheets or even accurate maps, the transport phase was a silent killer of schedules and budgets. Delays were common, breakdowns frequent, and the effort required was truly monumental. Every single stone you see in a medieval castle, from the smallest pebble in the mortar to the largest foundation block, represents a journey, a struggle against the very earth itself, hauled into place by sheer, unwavering, brutal force. The very act of transportation was a testament to the iron will of the Lord who commanded the castle's construction, and the enduring, often unseen, suffering of the laborers who made it possible. While stone was the undisputed king of castle construction, providing the massive, enduring bulk of the walls, timber was arguably the unseen queen, playing an absolutely vital, pervasive role in every stage of the building process. Without wood, the medieval castle simply could not have been built. It was essential for everything from the most basic tools to the towering scaffolding that allowed masons to reach dizzying heights. Imagine a construction site today without a single piece of wood. No temporary supports, no tool handles, no measuring sticks. It's almost unthinkable. In the medieval period, timber was even more crucial because of the limited range of alternative materials. Your first task on site, even before much of the stone arrived, would have been securing a steady supply of good quality wood. This meant sending teams of foresters and carpenters deep into nearby woodlands, felling trees, and hauling the massive logs back to the site. This was dangerous work, involving heavy axes, saws, and the constant risk of falling timber. It's a bit like trying to build a modern house without any structural beams or even a single wooden pencil. You'd quickly find yourself in a very difficult situation. Once at the site, the timber would be processed. Carpenters, highly skilled craftsmen, would shape the raw logs into everything imaginable. They created the scaffolding platforms and uprights that allowed masons to work safely, or at least more safely, on the upper levels of the walls. These intricate wooden structures, often temporary and frequently rebuilt as the walls rose, were the literal backbone of vertical construction. Without them, reaching the necessary heights would have been impossible, or at least required very long ladders and a remarkable disregard for gravity. Historians still argue whether medieval carpenters were considered artisans or primarily manual laborers. But wood's utility didn't stop there. It was used to build the cranes and hoisting mechanisms that lifted enormous stone blocks into place. These were often elaborate wooden frameworks, featuring large tread wheels like a giant hamster wheel, but for humans or windlasses, powered by men or oxen. Simple wooden ramps and sledges were used for moving heavy materials horizontally. All the hand tools, the handles of hammers, picks, and shovels, the frames of saws, relied on sturdy wood. Even the molds for casting lead, or the temporary wooden frames for arches and doorways known as centering, were made of timber. Furthermore, temporary shelters for the thousands of laborers, workshops for the various craftsmen, and even palisades for early site security were all constructed from wood. For the duration of the build, the castle site was essentially a bustling, temporary wooden city surrounding the emerging stone behemoth. When you look at the enduring stone walls of a medieval castle today, it's easy to forget the colossal amount of timber that was used, then dismantled, burned, or repurposed once the stone structure was complete. This invisible timber infrastructure, as much as the visible stone, was fundamental to the brutal, drawn-out nightmare of castle construction. With the site prepared, the materials sourced, and the basic infrastructure of wood beginning to take shape. It was time for the true genius of medieval construction to arrive, the master mason. This wasn't just a skilled craftsman, the master mason was the architect, the engineer, the project manager, and often the chief foreman, all rolled into one. He was the visionary who translated the Lord's desires for an imposing fortress into a practical, buildable plan, and then ensured its execution against all odds. Imagine the master mason arriving at the muddy, chaotic construction site. He's probably not wearing a hard hat, but he would carry a set of essential tools, a square, a level, a plumb rule, and perhaps a compass. These were the instruments of his craft, allowing him to lay out foundations with precision, ensure walls were vertical, and angles were true. His mind, however, was his most important tool. He possessed a deep, empirical understanding of geometry, mechanics, and structural integrity, built not from textbooks, but from generations of accumulated practical knowledge and hands-on experience. It's like hiring a world-renowned chef who doesn't use a recipe book, but just knows how to make everything perfect. The master mason was responsible for the entire design. He would translate the Lord's general requirements. I need a really big, really strong castle here, into detailed plans for curtain walls, towers, gatehouses, and the keep. He understood how forces would act on stone, how to distribute weight, and how to create stable arches and vaults. He didn't work from blueprints drawn on paper as we know them today. His plans might be sketched in charcoal on a prepared wooden board, or more commonly, held in his mind and communicated directly to his foremen and skilled masons. Historians still argue whether medieval master masons worked primarily from mental blueprints or from more detailed drawings now lost to time. Beyond design, the master mason was the chief overseer of construction. He would direct the quarrying operations, ensuring the right types and quantities of stone were extracted. He would supervise the cutting and shaping of individual stones by his skilled masons, ensuring each block fit perfectly into its designated place. He was responsible for the mixing of mortar, for the erection of scaffolding, and for problem-solving any unexpected challenges that arose: a collapsing trench, a stubborn rock formation, or a sudden change in design. This was a man constantly walking the site, inspecting work, barking orders, and making critical decisions that could mean the difference between a soaring success and a catastrophic collapse. His authority was immense, extending over hundreds, even thousands, of workers, from skilled masons and carpenters down to the raw, unskilled laborers. He was the one who ensured the brutal pace of work was maintained, pushing his teams to their limits while striving to ensure structural soundness. The master mason was a rare and highly valued individual, capable of turning a rough landscape and raw materials into a magnificent, enduring fortress. His vision and skill were the guiding force behind the brutal nightmare of construction, transforming unimaginable toil into architectural wonder. Beneath the visionary eye of the master mason and the precise work of the skilled carpenters and masons lay the vast, anonymous workforce, the apprentices and the legions of unskilled laborers. These were the true unsung heroes of castle construction. The thousands of individuals whose sheer brute force and relentless toil transformed raw materials into colossal walls, often at immense personal cost. Imagine the sheer numbers. A major castle project could easily employ hundreds, sometimes thousands, of workers at any given time. This wasn't a small, specialized team. It was a temporary, bustling city of sweat and muscle. At the top of this hierarchy were the skilled craftsmen, the masons, quarrymen, carpenters, blacksmiths, and smiths. These were trained professionals, often having undergone long apprenticeships, who commanded higher wages and respect. A master mason might earn a shilling a day, while his skilled journeyman might earn a few pence. It's like today's construction site, where you have the architects and engineers, then the specialized tradespeople, and then, well, everyone else. Below them, forming the vast majority of the workforce, were the unskilled laborers. These were often local peasants, farmers, or even serfs, conscripted or hired from surrounding villages. Their pay was meager, perhaps a penny or two a day, barely enough to feed themselves, let alone a family. Their work was the most physically demanding and repetitive, digging trenches, clearing rubble, hauling water, fetching tools, and, most crucially, moving the immense quantities of stone, timber, sand, and lime around the site. They were the human conveyor belts, carrying heavy baskets of mortar, dragging logs, and pushing crude carts, day in and day out, from dawn until dusk. Historians still argue whether medieval castle construction significantly impacted local agricultural labor pools. For these laborers, life on a castle construction site was brutal. They lived in temporary, often crude, encampments near the site, exposed to the elements. Sanitation was rudimentary, leading to the rapid spread of disease. Food was basic and repetitive, designed for sustenance rather than enjoyment. Their bodies were constantly pushed to their limits, with exhaustion being a chronic companion. Safety protocols, as we understand them, were virtually non-existent. Accidents were a daily occurrence, ranging from cuts and bruises to broken bones, crushed limbs, and often death. The lifespan of a medieval laborer on a major project was, let's just say, not destined for a gold watch and retirement party. It's not like they had ergonomic tools or mandatory stretch breaks. Their wellness plan was usually just trying not to get crushed by a falling rock. This massive pool of unskilled labor was the engine that drove castle construction. Their lives were cheap, their work essential, and their suffering largely unrecorded. When you look at the majestic, enduring walls of a medieval castle, remember that every stone, every brick, every inch of that structure was laid or lifted or prepared by thousands of forgotten hands, enduring conditions that would be unimaginable. Today, they were the silent, aching backbone of a monumental, brutal undertaking. With the stones quarried, timber felled, and thousands of laborers straining under the weight of the raw materials, it was time to turn these disparate elements into a cohesive, enduring structure. And for that, you needed mortar. Far from just being glorified mud, medieval mortar was a crucial, often overlooked, component of castle building, and its creation presented its own set of challenges, demanding specific materials and meticulous preparation to ensure the walls truly stood the test of time and weather. Imagine the scene at the mortar pits, a constant hive of activity, often smoky and dusty. The main ingredients were simple: lime, sand, and water. But getting the right proportions and consistency was an art, almost a science, mastered through generations of trial and error. The most critical component was the lime. This wasn't just any lime. It was quicklime, produced by burning limestone in massive, roaring kilns at extremely high temperatures. This process, known as lime burning, was dangerous and labor-intensive, requiring specialized kilns and a huge supply of wood as fuel. The quicklime would then be mixed with water in pits, a process called slaking, which generated immense heat and could be quite hazardous, potentially causing severe burns if not handled carefully. It's like trying to bake a cake, but the main ingredient is volcanic ash that might explode if you mix it wrong. Once slaked, the lime transformed into a soft, putty-like substance that would then be mixed with sand and water to create the mortar. The type of sand used was important. Coarser, angular sand generally made for stronger mortar. The proportions varied depending on the type of stone, the local climate, and the specific section of the wall being built. Too much sand and the mortar would be weak and crumbly. Too little and it wouldn't bind properly. The mixing itself was grueling work, often done by hand or by churning with shovels in large pits, sometimes using animal power. Thousands of tons of mortar would be needed for a single castle, meaning these pits were in constant operation. Historians still argue whether medieval builders had a more advanced understanding of hydraulic lime, which sets underwater than previously thought. The quality of the mortar was paramount for the longevity of the castle. It had to be strong enough to bind the massive stones together, yet flexible enough to accommodate slight movements and resist cracking due to temperature changes or settling. A poorly mixed or weak mortar could lead to structural failures, allowing water penetration, which in turn could lead to frost damage in winter, slowly eroding the integrity of the walls. It's the unsung hero, or villain, of a castle's long-term survival. The challenge of creating consistent, high-quality mortar across years of construction, often with varying raw materials, was immense. It required skill, vigilance, and an unceasing effort from the laborers dedicated to this dusty, messy, and absolutely essential part of the castle-building nightmare. Every solid, enduring wall you see today is a testament not just to the stone, but to the often overlooked, carefully crafted mixture that held it all together. With the raw materials ready and the mortar pits churning, the actual shaping and fitting of the stone could begin. But how did medieval builders, without the aid of power tools or sophisticated machinery, manage to cut, dress, and lift these massive blocks? The answer lies in their remarkably simple yet highly effective tools of the trade. These were instruments refined over centuries, relying on human strength, skill, and a deep understanding of leverage and material properties. Imagine a mason at work. He's not using a diamond-tipped saw. His primary tools are various types of hammers, chisels, and mallets. The heavy-headed setting hammer was used to adjust the position of large stones, while lighter dressing hammers and scabbling hammers were for rough shaping, for finer work and creating smooth, precise surfaces. Masons wielded chisels of varying sizes, striking them with wooden mallets. This was painstaking work, requiring incredible precision and patience. Every individual stone in a castle, particularly the finely dressed blocks used for corners, doorways, and windows, bore the marks of these hand tools, a testament to countless hours of meticulous labor. It's like building a Lego castle, but each Lego brick is a massive stone, and you have to hand-carve every single one before you can even snap it into place. Beyond the cutting and shaping, there were tools for measurement and alignment. The plumb rule, a simple string with a weight, was essential for ensuring walls were perfectly vertical. The square and level, often made of wood and sometimes incorporating a plumb bob, ensured that stones were laid flat and at right angles. These basic geometric tools allowed for remarkable accuracy, despite the seemingly crude nature of the construction. Historians still argue whether the geometric knowledge of master masons was intuitive or based on more formal, unwritten principles. 4. Lifting the colossal stones, medieval builders relied on ingenious applications of basic physics. while large, complex cranes powered by treadwheels, remember those giant hamster wheels for humans, were used for the heaviest blocks. Much lifting was done with simpler devices. Levers were fundamental. A long, sturdy wooden beam could be used to pry and lift heavy stones, with smaller stones or logs acting as fulcrums. Rollers, simple round logs, were placed under heavy blocks to reduce friction, allowing them to be moved horizontally with fewer people. Wedges, made of iron or wood, were driven under stones to gradually raise them. The combination of these tools, while basic, allowed for astounding feats of engineering. The real power came from the collective strength of the laborers and the specialized skill of the masons. Each strike of a hammer, each precise measurement, each straining lift contributed to the incremental rise of the castle walls. It was a testament to human ingenuity and perseverance, transforming raw rock into architectural marvels, one painstaking, back-breaking tool stroke at a time. The simple elegance of these tools belied the brutal reality of the labor they facilitated. As the walls of the castle began to rise, layer by agonizing layer, the need for masons and laborers to work at ever-increasing heights became paramount. This is where scaffolding entered the brutal nightmare of castle construction. Forget the sleek, metal structures of today. Medieval scaffolding was a perilous, often makeshift, assembly of timber, ropes, and a healthy dose of courage, or perhaps desperation. Every ascent was a risk, every platform a potential trap. Imagine yourself as a mason, perched precariously perhaps 50 or 60 feet above the ground, the wind whistling past your ears. Your workspace is a narrow wooden platform, supported by upright poles and horizontal beams, all lashed together with ropes or secured with wooden pegs. There are no safety harnesses, no hard hats, no modern guardrails. One misstep, one rotten plank, one snapped rope, and your career and life would come to a very sudden, very messy end. It's like trying to build a skyscraper while balancing on a very tall, very wobbly ladder, and occasionally someone gives the ladder a little shake. Medieval scaffolding typically came in two main forms. The simpler and often earlier method involved put-log holes. As the wall rose, gaps would be left in the stonework. Into these holes, short, horizontal wooden beams called put-logs would be inserted. These put-logs would then support longer, horizontal planks, forming the working platform. Vertical timbers would be placed against the wall to support the outer edge of the platform. As the wall grew taller, the lower put-logs would be removed, and new ones inserted higher up, allowing the scaffolding to be progressively raised. These holes, visible even today as square or rectangular indentations in old castle walls, are the silent witnesses to the dizzying heights and risks faced by medieval builders. Historians still argue whether medieval scaffolding designs were consistently effective or varied wildly in safety. The other method involved a more independent freestanding scaffold, particularly for very tall structures or where put-log holes weren't feasible. This involved a complex lattice of vertical and horizontal timbers built up from the ground, independent of the wall itself. This allowed for more flexibility, but required even more timber and careful bracing to prevent collapse. Regardless of the method, the construction of the scaffolding itself was a highly skilled job for the carpenters, who had to ensure it was sturdy enough to support not only the weight of the men, but also heavy stone, tools, and mortar. The dangers were immense. Ropes could fray, timber could snap under unexpected loads, and strong winds could destabilize the entire structure. Falling tools, falling stones, and falling men were common occurrences. Even the simple act of climbing up and down the rickety ladders or ramps was a constant peril. The sheer physical exhaustion of working at height, coupled with the ever-present danger, made the scaffold a terrifying element of the castle-building nightmare. Every stone laid above ground level represented not just immense labor, but also a constant dance with gravity, a silent prayer that the wooden supports would hold just long enough for one more block to be safely set in place. With the foundations laid and the scaffolding rising, the true essence of castle building began to take shape. The construction of the outer walls, also known as the curtain walls. These were the primary defensive barriers, massive and unyielding, designed to withstand siege engines, arrows, and direct assault. Building them was an epic undertaking, demanding colossal amounts of stone, continuous labor, and meticulous precision. Imagine standing inside the burgeoning construction site, looking up at what will become an impenetrable barrier. These walls were incredibly thick, often ranging from 8 to 20 feet or 2.5 to 6 meters at their base, sometimes even more for particularly strong castles like those in the concentric style. They weren't just solid blocks of stone all the way through, which would have been impractical and prohibitively expensive. Instead, they typically employed a technique called rubble infill or cavity wall construction. This meant masons would build two outer skins of finely cut and fitted stone blocks, the inner and outer faces of the wall. The space between these two skins, sometimes several feet wide, would then be filled with a mixture of smaller, rougher stones, rubble, gravel, and a huge quantity of mortar. This core, while not as perfectly dressed as the outer faces, solidified into a near-solid mass, providing immense strength and absorbing the impact of projectiles. It's like making a giant sandwich, but instead of delicious fillings, you're stuffing it with rocks and really, really hard concrete. The process of laying these walls was slow and methodical. Masons would carefully set each large, dressed stone on the outer faces, ensuring it was level and plumb, cementing it in place with mortar. Then, the laborers would rush in, dumping basket after basket of rubble and mortar into the core. This process would repeat, layer by painstaking layer, as the wall gradually rose. The weight of these walls was immense, requiring incredibly strong foundations to prevent subsidence, a constant concern for the master mason. Historians still argue whether the rubble infill technique was a sign of medieval efficiency or simply a cost-saving measure. The outer face of the curtain wall was often sloped outwards at the base, forming a talus or batter. This served several purposes. It made it harder for attackers to undermine the wall, caused projectiles to ricochet upwards, potentially harming attackers on scaling ladders, and increased the wall's resistance to battering rams. The top of the walls would be crowned with crenellations, the classic battlements, with alternating solid sections, merlons, and open gaps, crenels or embrasures, providing cover for defenders, while allowing them to fire arrows or drop projectiles on attackers below. Building these massive outer walls was not just about brute force. It required constant quality control. The master mason and his foreman would meticulously check the alignment and level of each course of stone, ensuring that the walls rose true and strong. A deviation early on could lead to catastrophic structural problems later. Every foot of height represented countless hours of quarrying, transport, mixing, lifting, and precise placement, making the steady, relentless rise of the curtain walls, the very heart of the brutal nightmare that was medieval. Castle construction. Rising above the formidable curtain walls, puncturing the skyline, were the towers. These weren't just decorative additions. They were strategic sentinels, vital components of a castle's defense, designed to provide flanking fire along the walls and act as strong points in their own right. Building them involved all the challenges of the curtain walls, but with added complexities due to their height, specialized defensive features, and often their internal structures. Imagine the sheer vertical ambition of these towers. They could be square, round, or D-shaped, each geometry offering different advantages and disadvantages in terms of structural strength and resistance to siege weaponry. A round tower, for instance, offered no corners for attackers to undermine, and cannonballs, when they eventually arrived on the scene, would glance off its curved surfaces more easily. Square towers, while easier to build, were more vulnerable. At their corners, historians still argue whether round or square towers offered superior defensive capabilities. The construction of a tower began with its immensely strong foundations, often dug deep into the bedrock, similar to the main walls. Then, layer by layer, the thick stone walls would rise, using the same meticulous techniques of dressed stone, outer faces, and rubble infill. But unlike the continuous curtain wall, towers had to accommodate multiple internal floors, accessed by spiral staircases built into the thickness of the wall itself. This required incredibly precise masonry to create the curving steps and supporting structures that wound their way upwards, often in complete darkness, lit only by small, flickering lamps. It's like trying to build a really tall, hollow tree. But every internal branch is a spiral staircase made of solid rock, and you're doing it with a hammer and chisel. As the towers ascended, they would incorporate specialized defensive features. Arrow slits, also known as loopholes or embrasures, were carefully designed openings in the thick walls, narrow on the outside to offer minimal target area to attackers, but splaying wider on the inside to allow defenders a broad field of fire. Building these required highly skilled masons to cut precise angles and ensure structural integrity around the voids. Higher up, at the very top of the towers and walls, you would find the machicolations. These were projecting, stone-built galleries, with openings in their floors, allowing defenders to drop stones, boiling water, or other unpleasantries directly onto attackers at the base of the wall without exposing themselves. Constructing these projecting features, often supported by corbels, was a complex feat of engineering, adding significant weight and requiring careful balance. The top of the towers would typically culminate in the same crenellated battlements seen on the curtain walls, providing further protected firing positions. But beyond their defensive utility, towers also served as living quarters, storage rooms, and sometimes even dungeons, adding to their internal complexity. Every tower, therefore, was a microcosm of the castle itself, a formidable defensive structure, a complex architectural challenge, and a testament to the brutal, painstaking labor of the medieval builders who painstakingly raised them, stone by heavy stone, towards the sky. While the towering curtain walls and formidable towers provided immense defensive strength, every castle had an inherent vulnerability, its gateway. This was the necessary point of entry, and therefore the most intensely fortified and elaborately designed section of the entire fortress. Building a medieval gatehouse was a masterpiece of defensive architecture, a complex puzzle of layers designed to trap, delay, and ultimately repel attackers. It was the castle's equivalent of an impregnable bank vault with more spikes. Imagine approaching a medieval castle, seeking entry. You wouldn't just find a simple door. Instead, you'd be confronted by a multi-layered death trap, a testament to centuries of siege experience. The gatehouse wasn't merely a single archway. It was often a substantial building in its own right, projecting outwards with its own towers, battlements, and murder holes. Its construction demanded the most skilled masons and the greatest attention to detail, as any weakness here could compromise the entire castle. Historians still argue whether the increasing complexity of gatehouses was a response to improved siege tactics or merely a datus. The very approach to the gatehouse was often designed to be difficult. You might have to cross a narrow bridge, turn sharply, or even walk through a narrow, exposed passage, all while being overlooked by arrow slits and machicolations. The first line of defense was often the barbican, an outer fortified gateway or detached tower that provided an additional defensive layer, forcing attackers to break through it before even reaching the main gatehouse. Building a barbican was almost like constructing a mini-castle in front of the main one, adding significantly to the overall complexity and cost. Then came the gatehouse proper, a series of daunting obstacles. The first would be the massive wooden doors, often reinforced with iron, thick enough to withstand battering rams and fire. Behind or in front of these doors, you would find the crucial portcullis. This was a heavy, often iron-reinforced wooden grille lowered vertically from slots in the gatehouse roof, constructing the deep slots for the portcullis within the massive stone walls, and designing the intricate mechanism of ropes and counterweights to raise and lower it, was a significant engineering feat. These gates and portcullises could be lowered independently, creating a killing ground or death trap between them. If attackers breached the first layer, they would find themselves trapped in this narrow passage, bombarded from above by archers and by objects dropped through murder holes in the ceiling. It's like a medieval security system that, instead of just setting off an alarm, attempts to turn intruders into very flat pancakes. The gatehouse itself was often flanked by its own formidable towers, providing flanking fire on anyone attempting to breach the entrance. These towers would contain guard rooms, winding staircases, and access to the upper levels and their defensive features. Every angle, every opening, every mechanism in the gatehouse was painstakingly designed for defense, making its construction one of the most intellectually demanding and physically grueling aspects of castle building, where a millimeter of error could mean the difference between security and catastrophic breach. If the curtain walls and gatehouse were the castle's shield, then the keep was its unyielding heart, its final, most formidable line of defense, and often the lord's primary residence. Building this central structure was a monumental undertaking, frequently the tallest and thickest walled part of the entire complex, a true testament to medieval engineering and an incredible drain on resources and human effort. Imagine the keep rising from the very center of the castle, a massive, block-like tower dominating the inner ward. Early keeps were often square or rectangular, like the famous White Tower of the Tower of London, or the colossal keep at Dover Castle. Later designs sometimes experimented with round or polygonal keeps, but the sheer scale remained constant. Their walls could be even thicker than the outer curtain walls, sometimes exceeding 15 to 20 feet, 4.5 to 6 meters in places, designed to withstand the most powerful siege engines and sustained bombardment. Construction involved all the brutal processes we've discussed: quarrying, transporting, cutting, and laying colossal amounts of stone. often lifted to dizzying heights using treadwheel cranes. Historians still argue whether the primary function of the keep evolved from a purely defensive stronghold to more of a lordly residence over time. Inside, the keep was a multi-story structure, a vertical fortress within a fortress. Each floor served a specific purpose. The ground floor was typically a dark, unlit basement or undercroft, used for storage of provisions, weapons, and sometimes as a dungeon. This level often had minimal openings, making it extremely difficult to undermine. Above this, you'd find the main hall, sometimes kitchens, and then, on the upper floors, the Lord's private chambers, chapel, and guest rooms. Building these internal spaces within such thick walls presented unique challenges. Think of the intricate work involved in creating large, vaulted ceilings on each floor, requiring sophisticated knowledge of arches and load-bearing structures. It's like trying to build a really tall, multi-story concrete bunker, but every floor has fancy arches, and you're pouring the concrete one bucket at a time. Access to the keep was often deliberately complicated and highly defensible. The main entrance was frequently on the first or even second floor, accessed by an external, easily destroyable wooden staircase or a drawbridge, preventing direct ground-level assault. This forced attackers to overcome this elevated entrance, exposing them to fire from above. Inside, spiral staircases, narrow and winding, built into the thickness of the walls, controlled access between floors, making it difficult for an enemy to rush upwards. The keep also housed its own vital amenities. It often contained its own well, ensuring a water supply even if the main castle well was compromised. It might have a small, private chapel and a dedicated kitchen. In essence, the keep was designed to be self-sufficient, capable of holding out even if the rest of the castle fell, providing a final, desperate refuge for the Lord and his most trusted retainers. The construction of the keep was, therefore, not just an architectural challenge, but a political statement, an unyielding symbol of power, forged by endless toil and designed for ultimate endurance against the most brutal of attacks. Within the formidable stone embrace of the castle walls, one resource was more critical than any other for sustained survival, especially during a siege: water. Without a reliable supply of fresh water, even the strongest castle would eventually fall, its defenders succumbing to thirst long before any enemy battering ram broke through the gate. Thus, securing wells and cisterns within the castle's perimeter was a paramount, often deeply challenging aspect of its construction. Imagine the absolute necessity. You have thousands of people, soldiers, household staff, the Lord's family, maybe even peasants, sheltering from conflict, all needing to drink, cook, and maintain some semblance of hygiene. Relying on external sources was too dangerous and unreliable. This meant finding water inside the walls. The ideal solution was a well dug deep into the earth until it struck an aquifer. This was an astonishing feat of engineering for the medieval period. Well shafts could plunge hundreds of feet, sometimes through solid rock, a terrifying, claustrophobic, and incredibly dangerous undertaking. It's like trying to dig a very, very deep and narrow tunnel straight down, in the dark, with only hand tools, hoping you hit liquid gold. The process of digging a well was slow and arduous. Laborers would descend into the narrow shaft, chipping away at rock and earth, hauling up buckets of spoil using simple winches and ropes. As the well deepened, ventilation became an issue, and the risk of toxic gases, collapse, or simply running out of air was constant. The work was so perilous that sometimes animals, like canaries, were lowered into the shaft to detect dangerous gases before men descended. And once water was found, the well had to be lined, usually with stone, to prevent collapse and keep the water clean. Historians still argue whether the depth of medieval wells was primarily a technical challenge or a test of sheer human endurance. If a suitable underground water source couldn't be found, or as a supplementary measure, castles would rely on cisterns. These were large underground reservoirs built to collect and store rainwater, often channeled from the castle's roofs and courtyards. Building a cistern involved excavating a massive pit, then carefully lining it with impermeable materials like clay or multiple layers of finely rendered mortar to prevent leakage. The larger the garrison and projected siege duration, the larger the cistern needed to be. While less glamorous than a well-maintained cistern was a lifesaver. The purity of the water was another concern. Stagnant water in cisterns could become a breeding ground for disease, a silent killer during prolonged sieges. Wells, while often providing cleaner water, could still be contaminated if enemy forces managed to poison the external water table, or if sanitation within the castle was poor. The constant need for clean, reliable water meant that the well-diggers and cistern builders endured some of the most dangerous and unheralded work on a castle site. Their success directly determined the castle's ability to withstand a prolonged siege, making their efforts literally a matter of life and death for everyone within the stone walls. While securing a water supply was paramount for a castle's survival, dealing with the inevitable byproduct of human habitation, waste presented an equally significant, though far less glamorous, set of challenges: drainage and sanitation. In medieval castles were rudimentary at best, often leading to conditions that would make your stomach churn today, and undoubtedly contributed to the spread of disease within crowded walls. Imagine the daily realities of life within those stone walls. Thousands of people, sometimes hundreds, crammed together, generating waste from cooking, eating, and simply living. There were no complex plumbing systems, no flush toilets, no garbage disposal units. The solutions were simple, often crude, and frequently odorous. It's like trying to manage a small city's waste disposal with nothing but a few buckets and a very strong stomach. You wouldn't last 5 minutes without wanting to flee for fresher air. The most common method for human waste disposal was the garderobe. This was essentially a stone chute projecting out from the castle wall with an opening on the inside that served as a privy. Waste would drop directly down the chute and either fall into the moat, providing an unpleasant but effective deterrent. For attackers, a kind of biological defense system, into a cesspit at the base of the wall, or, in some cases, directly into a river if the castle was built alongside one. While functional, they were far from sanitary. The chutes themselves could become clogged, and the open pits or moats would become breeding grounds for insects and disease. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood the link between sanitation and disease, or if it was simply a matter of convenience. For general refuse, food scraps, kitchen waste, animal waste from the stables, disposal was often even less organized. Much of it would be simply thrown into the castle ditch or courtyard, allowed to accumulate, or occasionally burned. Open sewers, if they existed at all, were usually simple channels cut into the ground to carry wastewater, away from kitchens or latrines, often discharging directly into the nearest body of water or unceremoniously pooling within the castle grounds. This created a persistent stench and an ideal environment for rats, flies, and other vermin, all carriers of disease. It's a bit like living next to a permanent outdoor garbage dump that occasionally overflows. The lack of effective drainage was another persistent problem. Rainwater could accumulate in courtyards, creating muddy, slippery conditions. Poorly managed runoff could undermine foundations or lead to dampness within the castle's lower levels, fostering mold and further unsanitary conditions. While some castles had rudimentary systems of culverts and channels to direct water away, these were often insufficient for the scale of precipitation or the amount of waste generated. The constant battle against filth and foul odors was a daily reality for castle inhabitants. This rudimentary approach to sanitation, while necessary for the sheer scale of the waste produced, was a major contributor to the unhygienic living conditions within medieval castles, making them prime environments for outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and other deadly diseases, a silent, unseen enemy that often proved more lethal than any attacking army. The construction of these basic systems was often an afterthought compared to the defensive walls, but their impact on daily life was undeniable. Within the formidable, often windowless, stone shells of medieval castles, a constant battle was waged against a pervasive adversary, darkness. Life inside these massive fortresses was lived predominantly in perpetual gloom, punctuated by the flickering, smoky light of rudimentary illumination. There were no light bulbs, no electric grids, and certainly no sun lamps to ward off the oppressive shadows. Imagine navigating the interior of a castle on a typical medieval day, particularly within the deeper recesses of the keep or the lower levels of the towers. Even in broad daylight, natural light struggled to penetrate the immensely thick walls and the small, strategically placed window openings. Corridors and spiral staircases were often shrouded in near-complete darkness, making every step a cautious one. At night, the darkness was absolute, save for the scant illumination provided by early, often inefficient, methods. It's like living in a giant stone-lined cave, where every corner holds a potential stubbed toe, or worse, a grumpy guard you didn't see coming. The primary source of artificial light came from fire. This meant torches, candles, and oil lamps. Torches, made of wood dipped in pitch or resin, provided bright but smoky and short-lived illumination. They were useful for moving through dark passages or for illuminating specific areas for a short period, but they filled the air with soot and posed a constant fire hazard in buildings made largely of wood roofs, floors, furniture, candles. Typically made from beeswax, more expensive, cleaner burning or tallow animal fat. Cheaper, but very smoky and smelly, offered a gentler, more sustained light. But their output was minimal, barely illuminating a small radius. You'd need dozens of candles just to adequately light a single large hall, making them a luxury for the wealthiest lords. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly lived in perpetual dimness, or if our modern perception is skewed. Oil lamps were another option, often simple clay or metal vessels filled with animal fat or vegetable oil, with a wick dipped in. These provided a steady, if dim flame, but like tallow candles, they produced a significant amount of smoke and odor. The quality of medieval indoor air, therefore, was generally quite poor, a constant cocktail of smoke, soot, and the lingering smells of daily life. Windows, as we will discuss later, were minimal and designed primarily for defense, not for light. Even the large windows of the Great Hall or Lord's Chambers, when they existed, were often unglazed or covered with oiled parchment or thin animal bladders, which let in light but blocked views, and still offered poor insulation. Glass, when used, was a rare and precious commodity, only appearing in very late medieval castles and primarily in chapels or the most important private chambers. The pervasive darkness shaped daily life within the castle. Activities were often dictated by the natural light cycle. Reading or intricate work was difficult after sunset, leading to early bedtimes. Social gatherings would take place around the central hearth, where the fire provided both warmth and light, or be augmented by a scattering of smoky torches and dim candles. The struggle to illuminate the vast, gloomy interiors was a constant, dirty, and dangerous reality for those who lived and worked within the medieval castle, adding another layer to the harshness of their existence. Just as relentless as the battle against darkness was the struggle against cold within the stone behemoths of medieval castles. Imagine trying to stay warm in a massive structure made entirely of rock, designed for defense rather than comfort, where drafts whispered through every arrow slit and the stone itself seemed to absorb all warmth. Heating a medieval castle, especially in winter, was a monumental, often losing battle. Your primary source of warmth was, invariably, fire. This meant massive fireplaces and hearths, strategically placed in key living areas like the Great Hall, the Lord's Chambers, and perhaps the main guardrooms. Building these fireplaces was an integral part of the castle's construction, requiring skilled masons to create robust stone flues and chimneys capable of drawing smoke upwards and outwards, preventing the interior from becoming completely smoke-clogged. However, these chimneys, while essential, were also enormous heat sinks, drawing much of the warmth directly out of the room along with the smoke. It's like trying to warm your house by leaving the front door wide open while the heating is on. Full blast, the fuel for these fires was overwhelmingly wood. This necessitated a constant, laborious supply chain from nearby forests. Teams of woodcutters would be perpetually engaged in felling, splitting, and hauling immense quantities of timber to the castle. Storing this vast amount of firewood within the castle walls or in defensible outbuildings was another logistical challenge. For the common soldiers and lower staff, their quarters might only have a simple braziers, metal containers for burning charcoal for heat, offering little warmth and posing significant fire and carbon monoxide risks. Historians still argue whether medieval people simply tolerated the cold better or developed subtle architectural techniques to mitigate it, even with roaring fires. The sheer volume of the stone walls and the high ceilings of castle rooms meant that much of the heat dissipated quickly. Stone is an excellent thermal conductor, meaning it rapidly absorbs heat from the air and radiates cold. Keeping an entire castle truly warm was an impossibility. Drafts were ubiquitous, whistling through ill-fitting doors, small windows, and defensive openings. In the deepest winter, even rooms with large fireplaces would have been surprisingly chilly, forcing inhabitants to bundle up in layers of wool and furs. Even indoors, for the vast majority of castle inhabitants, the soldiers, servants and labourers, their living conditions would have been perpetually cold and damp. Their sleeping quarters might be unheated, relying on body warmth and thick blankets. Diseases like pneumonia, bronchitis, and frostbite would have been common, particularly for those on guard duty or living in less sheltered parts of the castle. The luxury of truly warm, comfortable interiors was reserved for the highest nobility in their private chambers, and even then it was a relative comfort compared to modern standards. The endless struggle to combat the pervasive chill within these stone fortresses was another significant, exhausting and often brutal aspect of life and construction in a medieval castle, a constant reminder of the harsh realities of the age. When you envision a medieval castle, you might picture grand, sweeping views from large windows. The reality, however, was quite different. Windows and arrow slits in medieval castle construction were primarily designed for defense and secondarily for light, creating a distinctly gloomy, almost claustrophobic interior. Crafting these openings, particularly the specialized arrow slits, was a meticulous and structurally sensitive task for the masons. Imagine trying to balance the need for light with the absolute imperative for security. For much of the early and high medieval period, large unglazed windows were a serious vulnerability. A wide window was an invitation for an enemy to fire arrows in, or even attempt to climb through. Therefore, most openings were small, narrow, and often high up in the walls. These small openings did little to illuminate the vast interiors, contributing significantly to the pervasive darkness we discussed earlier. It's like trying to light a large ballroom with just a few tiny flashlights. You get some light, but mostly shadows. The most distinctive openings were the arrow slits, also known as loopholes or embrasures. These were narrow, vertical openings, typically splaying widely on the inside and tapering to a thin slit on the outside. This ingenious design allowed archers within the castle to have a wide field of fire, covering a significant area outside the wall, while presenting only a tiny target to enemy archers. Building these was far more complex than just leaving a gap. Masons had to carefully cut and fit stones around these splayed openings, ensuring that the structural integrity of the massive wall was not compromised. The angles and dimensions were crucial for effective defense, requiring precise calculation and execution. Historians still argue whether the design of arrow slits evolved purely from military necessity or if some aesthetic considerations played a role, sometimes, especially in later castles. Arrow slits might incorporate a cross-shaped opening across loophole, allowing both vertical and horizontal firing arcs. Others might have a small, circular opening at the base, known as an eyelet, designed to allow a downward shot. Each type of slit reflected evolving defensive tactics and the specific needs of the archers or crossbowmen. These were not just holes. They were precision defensive instruments carved into stone. Windows, when they became larger in later, more refined castles, particularly in the upper floors of keeps or the Great Hall, were still heavily protected. They might be recessed deeply into the wall, or have internal wooden shutters that could be quickly closed during an attack. Glass, as mentioned before, was incredibly rare and expensive, meaning most windows were either left open to the elements, or covered with oiled linen, parchment, or thin sheets of horn or animal bladder. These materials offered minimal insulation and little transparency, letting in diffused light but keeping out the view. The construction of every window and arrow slit was a delicate balance of defense, light, and structural strength. Each required skilled masons to carve the openings, ensuring the integrity of the surrounding masonry. These small, carefully crafted voids in the colossal stone walls were a constant reminder of the primary function of a castle, a fortress first, and a home second, forcing its inhabitants to live in a perpetual state of readiness, even at the expense of comfort and light. Once the monumental stone walls and towers had been painstakingly raised, and the internal structures of the keep began to take shape, one of the final, crucial phases of castle construction was roofing the castle. This wasn't just about keeping the rain out. It was about protecting the entire structure from the elements, ensuring its longevity, and adding another layer of defense. Without a proper roof, all the massive effort of quarrying, lifting, and setting stone would eventually be undone by water penetration. Imagine the vast expanse of the castle's interior, open to the sky like a giant, unfinished bowl. The primary areas requiring substantial roofing were the keep, the Great Hall, various internal buildings, and any covered passages. The materials used would vary depending on local availability and the lord's budget, but they all presented unique challenges in medieval construction. It's a bit like building a giant, incredibly intricate sandcastle, but then realizing you also need to build a really strong, waterproof lid for it that won't blow away. Timber was once again the unsung hero. Massive wooden beams, often entire tree trunks, would be hoisted into place to form the main structural framework of the roof. Carpenters, with their precise joinery skills, would create intricate truss systems to span the wide spaces of halls and keep chambers, designed to bear the enormous weight of the roofing material and resist strong winds. These were complex feats of carpentry requiring careful measurement and strong joints, often secured with wooden pegs. Historians still argue whether medieval carpenters relied primarily on traditional patterns or developed custom designs for each roof. Once the wooden framework was in place, the roofing material itself would be applied. The most common and durable material for important castle buildings was lead. Sheets of lead, while incredibly heavy and expensive, were highly malleable and completely waterproof, making them ideal for protecting valuable structures. However, lead had to be smelted and cast into sheets on or near the site, a dangerous and hot process, and then carefully lifted and fitted onto the roof. The sheer weight of lead roofs also demanded exceptionally strong supporting timber structures. Other materials included stone slates or tiles. These were lighter than lead, but still heavy, requiring careful overlapping to ensure waterproofing. They were durable but brittle and could be damaged by high winds or siege projectiles. For less important structures or temporary buildings, thatch reeds or straw might be used, but this was highly vulnerable to fire, a major weakness in a siege. A fire arrow hitting a thatched roof could quickly turn a defensive structure into a blazing inferno. The process of roofing was inherently dangerous. Working at heights, handling heavy materials, and navigating steep pitches meant that falls were a constant risk for the roofers. Moreover, the completed roof, while protective, could also become a vulnerability during a siege. Attackers might try to set it alight with flaming arrows or hurl incendiary projectiles onto it, forcing the castle's defenders to battle fires inside their own stronghold. The intricate, often invisible, work of medieval roofers was therefore not just about keeping the elements out, but about maintaining the long-term integrity and defensibility of the entire castle, a vital final step in its brutal construction. With the mighty stone walls towering and the roofs finally in place, the exterior of the castle began to look formidable. But inside, many areas would still have been rough, cold, and unwelcoming stone. The next phase, the interior finishing and plastering, was about transforming these raw, utilitarian spaces into something more habitable, comfortable by medieval standards, and visually appealing for the lord and his household. This was the less celebrated, but still labor-intensive work that made a castle a home, however Spartan. Imagine stepping inside a newly roofed great hall or a lord's chamber. The walls are bare, rough-hewn stone, possibly with traces of the mason's tools. While functional, It's not exactly cozy. The goal now was to create smoother surfaces, improve insulation, and add a touch of warmth and prestige. This often began with plastering. Lime plaster, made from slaked lime and sand similar to mortar, but often finer, would be applied in multiple layers over the rough stone walls. This was physically demanding work, requiring skilled plasterers to mix large quantities of the material and apply it evenly by hand, building up smooth, level surfaces. It's a bit like painting a very large, uneven brick wall, but with a much thicker, heavier material, and your brush is basically just your hand or a flat wooden board. Plaster served several important purposes. It created a smoother, cleaner surface that was easier to whitewash or paint, improving the aesthetics and light reflection within the often dim interiors. It also provided a degree of insulation, trapping a thin layer of air between the stone and the room, making the spaces marginally warmer and drier. On occasion, decorative elements might be incorporated into the plaster itself, or it could serve as a canvas for frescoes or painted hangings, particularly in important rooms like chapels or great halls. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of medieval plastering was functional insulation, smoothness, or decorative beyond plastering. Other interior finishing elements came into play. Wooden floors were often laid over upper stone vaults or joists, providing a warmer, more comfortable surface than bare stone. Carpenters would meticulously cut and fit thick timber planks, often made from oak, creating durable flooring. For the lord's private chambers and the great hall, wooden paneling or tapestries might be hung on the walls. Tapestries, though incredibly expensive and often imported, served a dual purpose. They were magnificent displays of wealth and status, and they provided crucial insulation against the cold, damp stone walls. Imagine the difference in warmth and atmosphere between a bare stone room and one hung with thick, colorful tapestries. Even less glamorous elements, like the construction of internal wooden partitions to create smaller rooms within larger spaces, or the fitting of stout wooden doors and shutters, contributed to the habitability of the castle. While the external shell screamed defense, the internal finishing was about making the brutal fortress just a little bit more livable, a necessary step to transform a cold, stone behemoth into a functional home for a lord and his household, however Spartan that home might still appear to modern eyes. While the master masons designed and the skilled craftsmen shaped, the vast majority of the medieval castle construction was built on the backs of thousands of laborers. Their lives on the building site were a relentless cycle of grueling daily toil, long hours, and meager pay, pushing human endurance to its absolute limits. This was the brutal, unromanticized reality of medieval mega-dash projects. Imagine a typical workday. You wake before dawn, perhaps in a crude, crowded hut near the site, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and unwashed bodies. Your breakfast might be a piece of coarse bread and some ale. Then it's straight to work, from sunup to sundown, 6 days a week, with Sunday as a day of rest mostly. There were no coffee breaks, no scheduled lunch hours beyond a quick, field-eaten meal, and certainly no paid overtime. Work continued until it was too dark to see, or until the supervisors decided enough was enough. It's like having a job where your boss literally watches the sun and decides when your shift ends. And every day is leg day. The work itself was relentlessly physical. You might spend your day endlessly digging trenches, hauling heavy buckets of water from a distant stream, or carrying baskets filled with sand, lime, or rubble up treacherous ramps to the masons on the walls. Other tasks included mixing mortar by hand or foot, moving timber, or clearing away vast amounts of debris. Every single task involved immense muscular effort, repeated hundreds or thousands of times a day. Your hands would be calloused, your back aching, and your limbs perpetually sore. There was no heavy machinery, no power tools, only raw human strength applied repeatedly. Historians still argue whether medieval laborers were truly slaves or if their conditions, while harsh, offered a degree of personal freedom. The pay for these unskilled laborers was astonishingly low, often just a penny or two a day. While this might seem insignificant, a penny in medieval times had more purchasing power than today. However, it was barely enough to sustain an individual, let alone a family, and much of it would go towards basic food, cheap ale, and perhaps rudimentary lodging. There were no benefits, no health insurance, no retirement plans. If you got sick or injured, your pay stopped, and you were on your own. Your livelihood was entirely dependent on your ability to perform strenuous physical labor for those conscripted through feudal obligations. The situation could be even worse, as their labor might be unpaid altogether, considered part of their duties to their lord. These laborers lived in temporary, often squalid conditions in makeshift camps around the castle site. Disease spread easily in such crowded, unsanitary environments, and basic amenities were scarce. Their lives were a testament to endurance, a grim example of the human cost extracted to build the monumental symbols of medieval power. Every stone in that castle, every high wall and deep moat, represented not just the lord's ambition, but the brutal, unremitting daily grind of the thousands of anonymous laborers who built it with their very lives. The grueling daily toil and primitive working conditions on a medieval castle construction site meant that injuries and accidents weren't just possibilities. They were an almost inevitable part of the workday. Building a colossal stone fortress with rudimentary technology was inherently dangerous, and the toll on human lives and limbs was immense. Imagine the sheer number of ways things could go wrong. You're working amidst towering walls, enormous stones being hoisted overhead, vast pits being dug, and heavy timbers being maneuvered. There were no safety inspectors, no hard hats, unless you count a basic leather cap, no steel-toed boots, and certainly no comprehensive safety training. Gravity, brute force, and blunt objects were your constant, silent companions. It's like being perpetually stuck in a very low-budget action movie, where every scene involves something heavy almost falling on your head. One of the most common and devastating accidents involved falling objects. A stone could slip from a hoist, a tool could be dropped from scaffolding above, or a section of an inadequately braced trench could collapse. Being struck by falling rock could lead to crushed limbs, severe head injuries, or instant death. Similarly, falls from height were a constant peril. Working on narrow, unstable scaffolding dozens of feet up, or on slippery, uneven wall tops, meant that a single misstep, a moment of dizziness, or a sudden gust of wind could send a laborer plummeting to the ground below. Broken bones, shattered skulls, and internal injuries were the grim consequences. Historians still argue whether medieval construction sites had a higher rate of severe injury compared to other dangerous occupations of the time. Beyond falls and falling objects, the very nature of the work led to a host of other debilitating injuries. Quarrying involved chisels glancing off stone, sending sharp fragments flying, often resulting in eye injuries or deep cuts. Hauling immense weights repeatedly led to chronic back problems, hernias, and joint damage. Masons, despite their skill, risked cutting their hands or fingers, and the constant vibration from hammering could lead to long-term nerve damage. Even the simple act of mixing caustic lime for mortar could cause severe chemical burns if not handled carefully. Medical care on site was virtually non-existent beyond basic first aid, often administered by fellow laborers or camp followers. Severe injuries meant a high likelihood of infection, amputation if a skilled barber surgeon was present, or death. A broken leg or a debilitating back injury could mean the end of your working life, leaving you destitute and dependent on charity. There was no workers' compensation, no disability insurance. Your body was your tool, and if it broke, you were discarded. The human cost of building these magnificent structures was, therefore, not just measured in labor hours, but in the countless shattered bones, lost limbs, and truncated lives of the anonymous workers who faced death and disability as a daily reality of the castle construction nightmare. Beyond the immediate dangers of falling stones and perilous heights, the crowded and often unsanitary conditions of medieval castle construction sites created a perfect breeding ground for disease, for the thousands of laborers living and working. In close proximity, illness was a constant, often more lethal, threat than any workplace accident. Imagine the typical construction camp, a sprawling collection of temporary huts, tents, and crude shelters, often built quickly and with little thought for hygiene. Thousands of men, and sometimes their families, would be crammed together. Clean water, even when sourced from the castle's newly dug well, was rarely truly clean or plentiful enough for the entire camp. Waste disposal was rudimentary at best, with refuse and human excrement often accumulating in nearby ditches or simply tossed into the general camp area. It's like a very large, very smelly, outdoor dormitory where nobody quite understands what germs are. You probably wouldn't last a week without catching something unpleasant. These unsanitary conditions, combined with poor nutrition and the sheer physical exhaustion of constant labor, made the workforce incredibly vulnerable to a host of infectious diseases. Dysentery, often called the bloody flux, was rampant, spread by contaminated food and water, leading to severe dehydration and often death. Typhoid fever, another waterborne illness, would also sweep through camps, marked by high fevers, weakness, and intestinal issues. Simple colds could escalate into pneumonia in the damp, cold environment, and even minor cuts and scrapes. Common occurrences on a construction site could easily become infected, leading to gangrene and, without modern antibiotics, often amputation or death. Historians still argue whether disease outbreaks were the single largest cause of mortality on medieval construction sites. The movement of so many people also facilitated the spread of diseases from local populations, and workers themselves could carry illnesses from their home villages. A new influx of laborers might unwittingly bring a fresh wave of infection to the camp. Once a disease took hold, its spread was rapid and merciless, with little to no effective medical intervention available. There were no doctors with sterile instruments or knowledge of germ theory. Basic herbal remedies or superstitious practices were often the only forms of treatment, which offered little defense against serious bacterial or viral infections. Mass graves were not uncommon near large construction sites, silent testaments to the hidden human cost of these monumental undertakings. The loss of life due to disease could significantly slow down construction, as new laborers had to be recruited and trained. further extending the brutal timeline of the project. The very conditions necessary to house and feed the vast workforce inadvertently created an invisible enemy, a relentless plague that preyed on the weakest and most exhausted, making disease an ever-present, silent partner in the nightmare of medieval castle building. With thousands of hungry mouths to feed, and bodies constantly expending immense energy, the task of feeding the workforce on a medieval castle construction site was a monumental logistical challenge in itself. This wasn't a simple matter of ordering pizza. It involved securing, transporting, and distributing vast quantities of basic foodstuffs in an era without modern refrigeration or efficient supply chains. The survival of the entire project literally hinged on keeping the laborers fueled. Imagine the sheer scale: hundreds, sometimes thousands, of men, all needing calories to perform grueling physical labor, day in and day out. Their diet, while functional, was far from luxurious. The staples would have been grain, primarily for making bread and porridge, and vast quantities of ale. Bread provided essential carbohydrates and calories, while ale, often weak and watery, served not only as a beverage, but also as a safer alternative to potentially contaminated water and a source of some nutrients. It was the medieval equivalent of your daily energy drink, just a lot less bubbly and more grain-based. Historians still argue whether medieval laborers' diets were adequate for the strenuous work they performed. Securing these provisions required extensive planning and a dedicated effort from the Lord's administration. Large quantities of grain would have to be purchased from local farmers, or sometimes extracted as feudal dues from the Lord's own lands. This grain then needed to be milled into flour, a process often done at the Lord's own mills, and then baked into bread, usually by a team of bakers working tirelessly near the construction camp. Similarly, vast amounts of barley would be needed for brewing ale, often done on site or in nearby breweries. Meat would have been a less frequent, but important, addition, primarily for protein. This could come from hunting or from livestock raised on the Lord's estates. Fish, particularly during religious fast days, would also be procured from local rivers, lakes, or coastal areas. Vegetables and legumes, such as peas and beans, would supplement the diet, providing much-needed vitamins and fiber, often grown in nearby fields or gathered from the wild. The logistical nightmare involved not only acquiring these goods, but also transporting them to the remote construction site, protecting them from spoilage and theft, and distributing them equitably among the laborers. It's like trying to cater a massive, multi-year event in the middle of nowhere, with no refrigerators, and you're relying on ox carts for delivery. The food provided would be simple, often monotonous, but crucial for maintaining the workforce's strength and morale. Such as it was, a hungry, underfed workforce would be a weak, inefficient, and potentially rebellious one. Therefore, ensuring a steady, if basic, supply of food and drink was as critical to the castle's construction as the stone and timber themselves, a constant, underlying challenge that demanded significant resources and continuous effort from the Lord's coffers and the relentless labor of his provisioners. This constant need to fuel human engines was yet another dimension to the brutal, complex nightmare of medieval castle building. While the sheer physical labor and logistical challenges were immense, the true underpinning of any medieval castle construction was its cost and funding. Building one of these colossal stone fortresses was an incredibly expensive undertaking, arguably one of the most significant financial burdens a medieval lord or monarch could possibly shoulder. This wasn't a project you paid for with pocket change. It required vast, sustained wealth, stretching treasuries to their limits and often demanding creative, sometimes coercive, methods of funding. Imagine a modern-day megaproject, like a new national infrastructure system or a space exploration program, and then strip away all modern financial institutions, banks, and standardized currencies. That's closer to the scale of the financial challenge faced by a medieval lord. The costs were astronomical and continuous. You had to pay for materials, not just the initial purchase of quarrying rights or the direct cost of stone, if not from your own land, but also the timber, lead for roofs, iron for tools and fittings, lime for mortar, and vast quantities of fuel for kilns and hearths. Every single component had a price. It's like trying to fund a new city from scratch, but all your money is in heavy bags of gold, and you have to personally count every coin. Then came the labor costs. While unskilled laborers were paid meager wages, there were thousands of them, and their pay had to be consistent, week after week, month after month, for years. The highly skilled master masons, carpenters, and blacksmiths commanded much higher wages, reflecting their rare expertise. You also had to factor in the costs of feeding and housing this massive workforce, providing tools, and replacing worn-out or broken equipment. This wasn't a one-off payment. It was a constant, voracious drain on resources. Historians still argue whether the financial strain of castle building contributed to feudal instability or consolidated power. So, how did medieval lords and kings fund these colossal undertakings? The primary sources were usually feudal dues and taxes from their lands and vassals. Peasants were obligated to provide labor, corvée labor, or payments in kind or coin. Vassals owed military service or financial contributions. For kings, royal taxes levied across their domains were crucial. However, these traditional sources often weren't enough, especially for ambitious projects. Lords might resort to loans from wealthy merchants, abbots, or even Jewish moneylenders, though this was complex due to religious prohibitions on usury. Sometimes they would exploit newly acquired lands or even resort to outright plunder from conquered territories to fund construction. The financial strain could be immense. Many lords found themselves deeply in debt, their treasuries depleted for decades by the cost of a single castle. This immense financial burden meant that not just anyone could build a castle. It was the exclusive domain of the most powerful and wealthy, a visible manifestation of their ability to command vast economic resources. The castle, therefore, was not just built of stone and sweat, but of countless coins, complex financial maneuvers, and the relentless extraction of wealth from the land and its people, making its funding a brutal, intricate nightmare in itself. Given the sheer scale of the materials, the primitive technology, and the reliance on human muscle power, it should come as no surprise that medieval castle construction projects were not completed overnight. They demanded incredibly lengthy timelines, often stretching for years, sometimes even decades, and occasionally spanning multiple generations. This enduring commitment of time was yet another dimension of the brutal nightmare of building these colossal fortresses. Imagine a project today that takes 10 or 20 years to complete. That's a huge undertaking. Now imagine that in a medieval context, where life expectancy was significantly shorter and political stability was often fleeting. A large, complex stone castle might take 5 to 10 years for basic completion, but the more ambitious ones could easily consume 15, 20, or even 30 years of continuous labor. Some of the most famous castles, like Carnarvon Castle in Wales, were under construction for over 40 years, effectively encompassing the entire adult life of many of the laborers who worked on it. It's like waiting for a software update that literally takes your entire childhood to download. Several factors contributed to these extended timelines. Firstly, the slow pace of manual labor was paramount. Every stone had to be quarried, transported, dressed, and lifted by hand. Every sack of mortar mixed, every timber cut. There were no shortcuts, no fast-track methods that could significantly accelerate the process. The sheer volume of material to be processed and moved simply demanded an immense amount of time. Historians still argue whether the length of construction projects was primarily limited by labor availability or by the seasonal nature of medieval work. Secondly, seasonal work played a major role. Construction often slowed dramatically or even halted entirely during the harsh winter months. Freezing temperatures made mortar unworkable, icy conditions made hauling dangerous, and short daylight hours limited productivity. Laborers might return to their farms during harvest season, further interrupting the flow of work. This meant that the construction was a stop-and-start affair, losing months of progress each year, and adding to the overall duration. Thirdly, funding was a constant challenge. As we discussed, these projects were incredibly expensive. A lord might run out of funds, forcing a pause in construction until more revenue could be raised. Wars, political upheavals, or even changes in the lord's personal fortunes could lead to unexpected and lengthy interruptions. A castle might be started by one generation, only for its completion to fall to their children or grandchildren. This often led to architectural inconsistencies or changes in design as new master masons took over or new defensive theories emerged. Finally, the sheer complexity and iterative nature of design added to the time. As new siege technologies emerged, or as defensive weaknesses were identified, designs might be altered mid-construction, adding new towers, strengthening walls, or deepening moats. This adaptability, while strategically sound, inevitably stretched the construction period. The very longevity of these projects meant that the brutal nightmare of construction was not a sprint, but a grueling, multi-decade marathon, consuming vast fortunes and countless lives across the span of generations. As the last stone is theoretically placed, the final roof beam secured, and the echoing clang of hammers fades into history, we are left with the colossal, enduring legacy of the medieval castle. This journey through its brutal construction reveals not just how these formidable structures were built, but the immense human cost and ingenuity behind them. As you drift towards sleep, let the final images of these stone giants settle gently in your mind. Transformed from fairy tale fortresses into monuments of human endeavor and sacrifice, these castles, standing for centuries, are a tangible link to a distant past. They are testaments to an era of constant conflict, strategic necessity, and the raw, unyielding power of feudal lords. But more profoundly, they are monuments to the ordinary people, the quarrymen, the laborers, the masons, the carpenters, whose unremitting toil, sweat, and often lives were poured into their very fabric. Every weathered stone, every arrow slit, every towering wall whispers a story of arduous labor, ingenious problem-solving, and the sheer human will to survive and thrive in a harsh world. They remind us that even the most impressive feats of engineering, without modern technology, relied on the simplest, yet most brutal, application of muscle and basic physics. The nightmare of their construction wasn't just in the danger, but in the relentless, repetitive nature of the work, stretching for years under the elements. Yet, from this grinding effort arose structures that have outlasted empires and witnessed the flow of centuries, standing sentinel over the landscapes they once dominated. Now, as the imagined sounds of chisels and groans fade completely, allow yourself to sink into the quiet comfort of your own space. The vast stone walls give way to the soft boundaries of your room. The cold, damp air of the medieval quarry is replaced by the gentle hum of your fan, if you have one. All the strenuous effort, the endless toil, the historical echoes of the past are now complete. There is nothing more to build, nothing more to learn tonight. Simply let the weight of the day lift from you, like the morning mist rising from a medieval battlefield. Feel yourself settling deeper, heavier, into your bed, completely at ease. The stories are told, the history is observed. All that remains is the profound stillness of the night, inviting you into a deep, restorative sleep. Just breathe and simply be. Sweet dreams.